Welcome to this lecture on Acts and Paul. Well, before we move into new material, I thought it would be helpful for us to review some of the ground that we've already covered. I thought that would be helpful for two reasons, because we can kind of practice this approach, make sure we can work out all the bugs, both on my end and yours. I'm sure there'll be plenty of bugs on my end that need to be worked out. And also, it will be helpful for us to review a bit, given the fact that we've been away from this for a little while. We'll be moving on in the coming weeks to talk about our salvation in Christ, justification, sanctification, and the Spirit and all that. And I think it would be helpful to really have in our minds the sinfulness of sin. You know, what is this wicked condition that Christ saves us from? So with that in mind, I think a couple lectures here where we review Paul's doctrine of sin will be helpful. We're going to look at this in four categories. One, the universality of sin. Second, the theological starting point of sin. Remember, we looked at that in class. We talked about whether it's a theological or anthropological starting point. We'll see the consequence of sin, death and bondage. And then as an extension of that thought, we'll see bondage and the law. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I am pulling a lot of this from Ritterboss's book, Paul, an Outline of His Theology, and that is Herman Ritterboss. He, I think, presents things really, really well. These are sections in his chapter on sin. Now, Ritterboss goes into it with a lot more depth, and there are many more sections, but these are the highlights that I wanted to pull out and explain. So first, we're going to look at the universality of sin, and we want to begin with just a overview, sort of just getting our, just coming in somewhat slowly into this topic. And I want to just look at some of the words that Paul uses to describe our sinful condition. I think that doesn't, in itself, if we just look at the words, that's not a complete theology, but familiarizing ourselves with the language, at least, I think gets us started. So by telling you the words that Paul uses, I'm not intending to give you the full theology of Paul's view of sin. That will come later as we try to look at the meaning of these words and how that fits with this theology overall. But just at least familiarizing ourselves with the language of the apostle will be helpful for us as we go on. Well, first, there's this word from which we get many different English words, a variety of English words that all have the same idea. That's just basic meaning of sin. In Greek, it's hamartia, commit sin or sinful or sinner. This word group basically has the idea of missing the target, falling short, right? It's intended, our intention is to go one way. That's what God created us to be, right? Westminster Confession of Faith, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, right? I mean, that's the target that we are aiming for, but of course we fall short of that. We don't hit the target. We do something else instead, right? Here's the bullseye, here's what we're aiming for, but we go off target, off course. We do not glorify God and enjoy Him forever. One thing interesting to note here is that almost every time this word is used, it's used in the singular, right? Paul does not talk about the sins, plural. He talks about sin. We'll come back to this idea when we look at more about the universality of sin and the sinful condition. But just note that here as we talk about the language, right? We're just familiarizing ourselves with the language at the very beginning. Another word that Paul uses is the word trespass. The root meaning here is to fall, like to fall flat on your face, to fall down. And Paul uses sin and trespass quite often together. Actually, they are used often in the Bible that way. Isaiah in particular talks about sins and iniquities or trespasses. Romans 5:15, but the free gift is not like the trespass, right? Another word is transgression or transgressors. And this has a technical meaning, a specific disobedience to the commands of God. So transgression comes into view when the law comes into view, Romans 4:15. And where there is no law, there is no transgression, right? So the law is pictured as like this boundary marker. And you're not a transgressor as long as you stay within the law, but whoops, we went out there, and transgressor is to go outside the boundary, right? Not to stay within the boundary that God has, is to go outside of that. This will be an important word when we think about the nature of the law later on. There's another word that Paul uses very often to describe the sinful condition, and that is the flesh. This is a word that requires some careful consideration, because at its root, flesh just means the physical condition of our lives, right? We are bodies, right? We have skin and bones and blood. We're flesh. Now, why does Paul use a word that simply refers to the physicality of our existence? Why does he use a word like that to describe the sinfulness of our condition? Why does he do that? And let me just show you some proof here that this word does refer to the physicality of our existence, right? There's times where Paul uses this word simply to indicate the physical nature of our existence. So Colossians 2:1, those who have not seen me in the flesh. Now, interesting, the ESV translates that face to face. That's the sense of what Paul means. But he uses this word flesh, sarx. Or a couple verses later, absent in the flesh but present in the spirit. Interesting, the ESV translates that as body, but it's the same word, flesh. These words are identical. So Paul will use this word without any negative connotation, without trying to talk about how we are evil and wrong. The word at root just means our physical condition, the physicality of our condition. Why then does Paul use this word that talks about the physicality of our condition to refer to our sinfulness? Well, some have proposed wrongly that what Paul's working with here is some sort of dualism, where we have the spirit world, versus the physical, and everything about our physical world, right? The things we do with our body, our bodily existence, that's here and that's bad. Everything up here in the spirit world, which is just our non-physical part of us, is good. Now, there were people who taught that. It's called Gnosticism. There were people who believed this and taught this back in Paul's day. And some have proposed that by using this word flesh, Paul is essentially buying into this philosophy. And I know that couldn't be further from the truth. And the reason is that there are so many ways that Paul talks about our physical body as being good. The fact that we have bodies is not a sign of our sinfulness. That's not what makes us sinful, right? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:44, he talks about the spiritual body, right? The fact that Paul can talk about a spiritual body should show that this duality is certainly not what Paul has in mind at all. And the spiritual body is the body filled with, glorified by, enlivened by the Spirit. The resurrected body is what Paul talks about. So the fact that we're going to have resurrection bodies is a sign that Paul is not at all falling into this dualism, this Gnosticism. Or 1 Corinthians 6:13, the body is meant for the Lord and the Lord for the body, right? If the body is meant for the Lord, then it is not inherently evil. Okay, so if Paul is not using this word flesh, this word sarx, to refer to this dualism between what is our physical existence and the non-physical, spiritual part of our existence, what then does this dualism refer to? Well, or rather, what does the word flesh refer to? I think what Paul is doing here is Paul wants to show... let me back up here and say, just show you how Paul uses this word to describe our sinfulness. Classic passage, Galatians 5:16. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh, right? And when Paul talks about the desires of the flesh, he means those things that we want that are bad, right? The desires of the flesh are against the Spirit. So Paul does indeed use this word flesh to talk about the sinfulness of our condition. What's going on with the meaning of this word when he does that? Well, I think what Paul means by flesh is he means our life viewed without God in view. Flesh refers to something that is inherently weak. Paul is thinking of the Old Testament context of this word. For instance, in Isaiah 40, verse 6, all flesh is grass, right? All flesh is weak, all flesh is transitory, it's chopped down, it's thrown in the fire. Or an interesting way he uses this, Isaiah uses this word in chapter 31, verse 3. The Egyptians are men and not gods. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. Notice this. Their horses are flesh. Their horses are weak. Their horses cannot give you the kind of salvation that you want them to give you, right? Because the Israelites are tempted to go to the Egyptians for help in their to escape the invading Assyrians. And God, through the prophet Isaiah, is saying, don't do that, because those Egyptians are really not able to give you any kind of salvation because they're so weak. Their horses are weak. So flesh refers to weakness. And our physical bodies are an aspect of our weakness, right? Think of the coronavirus wreaking havoc all over the world. We're not as strong as we think we are, right? We are physical beings, and locked in this physical world, there is a profound weakness to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not goodness to it, but there is weakness to it. And the word flesh highlights that weakness of our nature apart from God's Spirit that is what enlivens us and gives us life. See, we're never made to live our lives as mere flesh. We're supposed to be living our life with God, with Him living in us, with His Spirit giving us life. We're not supposed to live our lives by ourselves as if this material life is all there is. So when Paul uses the word flesh, he's wanting to draw attention to our life lived as if there was no God. Our life lived unto ourselves, depending upon ourselves for our own salvation. That is the essence of flesh. And that is a perspective on the essence of sin, life in itself apart from God. So the word flesh then, in conclusion, is not at all playing into a kind of dualism where our material existence, our bodily existence is evil or wrong in any way. That's not what Paul intends. But he does want, when he says the word flesh, us to think of what it's like to live apart from God. And that is the essence of what Paul is getting at with that word flesh. Now, there's many other words that Paul uses to describe the sinfulness of our condition, or what it's like to live in rebellion against God. And this list comes partially from theologian Douglas Moo in an article that he wrote on Paul's understanding of sin. And I added a few words and took some away. But let me just run through these briefly. These are just different ways that Paul talks about the essence of sin. One is unrighteousness. Right, Romans 1:18, and by the way, most of these references will come from Romans, and I'll tell you why at the end. Romans 1:18 talks about those who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, not righteous. God is righteous, the standard of justice and truth, and to be unrighteous is to fall short of that standard. Or disobedience. This is a word that Paul uses, Romans 11:32, for God has consigned all to disobedience that he might have mercy on all. We are made to obey God, to listen to his voice, to follow him. To disobey is to go in the other way. All we like sheep have turned astray, to not follow him or obey his commands. Or there's also the word uncleanness. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 6:7, touch no unclean thing. Paul is referring to this category in the law of uncleanness or pollution, that which is not pure and holy before God. Or Paul talks about lawlessness. He says in Romans 6:19, for just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity, an idea of uncleanness again, and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification. Lawlessness is contrasted with sanctification. Lawlessness is not obeying the law, not having the law, not adhering to the law. Or godlessness, or another way to say that is being without God. Ephesians 2:12, Paul talks about those who are without God in this world. Literally, he uses the word the prefix theos, without God, not having God. God has made us for relationship with him. To be godless is to be without God. Or ungodly. This word occurs in a long list of other words that talk about sin. Let me just read you one of those lists. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8. Paul says that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinner, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. List there of many things that are sinful, many different perspectives on sin. Paul also talks about unbelief. Romans 11:20, they were broken off because of their unbelief. We are supposed to trust in God, to believe him. Unbelief is to think God's word is not true. It's the original part of the original sin back in the garden, right? Adam and Eve disbelieved God's word, and that was the cause, the start of many other things. Let's see. Unfaithfulness, that is another word that Paul uses. Romans 3:3. What if some are unfaithful? Unfaithfulness here, Paul is picking up on the notion of unfaithfulness in the Old Testament, which was a way of talking about Israel in their covenant breaking. Israel broke the covenant with God because they were unfaithful to him. Their idolatry was unfaithfulness. They were in a covenantal relationship with God where they were supposed to give him all of their worship, all of their devotion. But they sought after other gods. And in the Old Testament, again and again, unfaithfulness or idolatry is adultery, because it is breaking the covenant with God. And we see evidence that Paul, even though he doesn't use this word unfaithfulness much, he is thinking of sin in a similar way, that our idolatry, our unfaithfulness is adultery. Paul is using that marital metaphor, that marital understanding. We see this in Ephesians 5 in the way Paul talks about how we ought to be and will in fact be presented to Christ as a bride without spot or wrinkle, right? That's the opposite of unfaithfulness. And in 2 Corinthians 11:2, Paul talks about how he is how the people are betrothed to Christ, and he is jealous with a godly jealousy that he might present the church to Christ as a pure virgin to him. So we see how Paul uses the opposite of unfaithfulness as he talks about the church being fully presented to Christ as a bride, as a pure wife. So unfaithfulness, which is adultery, is another way that Paul talks about our sinful condition. Or Paul also talks about ignorance. Romans 10:3, for being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. That's a verse we're going to come back to later when we talk about the law. But part of our sinfulness is not knowing what we should know. He's condemning Israel here for their ignorance, but this was a willful ignorance. They had forgotten what they ought to have known. Or sin is also an error. Romans 1:20, receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. It is to make a mistake. It is not merely a mistake, but it is a mistake. It is something that is gone wrong. Paul also talks about sin in terms of futility or vanity. Romans 1:20, they became futile in their thinking. Futility is the idea that it is broken. It doesn't achieve the end in which it is intended to achieve. Sin is futile. It does not accomplish what it wants. Sin is also a lie. Romans 1:25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. That's why it is futility, because it is not true. Paul contrasts truth, which is in Christ, with lying. Paul's concept of lying is actually much more broad than simply saying something that is untrue. It is really not confessing Christ, living and speaking contrary to the reality that God has established with Christ overall. Sin is also to stumble. Romans 11:32, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone. It is to fall, going back to that word trespass, to fall flat on our face. Sin is to be knocked over, not to stand. Sin is also doing what is evil. Romans 7:19, for I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want to do is what I keep on doing. Evil here is a more generic word that just means bad. It means not beautiful, not good and true. We do that which is not good and true and beautiful. That is to sin. Deeds of darkness, as another way Paul talks about sin. Romans 13:12, the night is far gone, the day is at hand, so let us cast off the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Darkness has the idea of that which we do in secret. That's what we do away from God and his truth. It's the shameful deeds of darkness, things that we don't want anybody else to see, but that we do them anyway. Or another way Paul talks about sin is not obeying the gospel. Romans 10:16, but they have not obeyed the gospel. They have not all obeyed the gospel. This is disobedience not only to God's truth, to God's command, or God's law in general, but disobedience to the gospel itself. Where Paul also talks about sin in terms of the works of the flesh. Now, we already talked about the flesh as being that perspective on life which excludes God, which tries to get him out of the way, which looks at life as if there was no God working, looking at life in and of ourselves, depending upon ourselves. Well, the works of that sinful fleshly perspective are evident, Paul says. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. In other words, the list could go on and on and on. And Paul has stopped it here, but he wants you to just get you thinking all the different ways in which sin can manifest itself. Sin is also, I don't have this here, but idolatry. 1 Corinthians 10:14, therefore, my beloved, flee idolatry. Again, we said that idolatry is adultery. It is worshiping something other than God. Now, what do we make of this extensive list, all these different nuances? Well, two things. One related to ministry, and one related to our understanding of Paul's theology. First, related to ministry, I just think it's helpful for us to recognize that sin doesn't come at us in only one dimension, only one way. There's hundreds, thousands even of different nuances that it takes, different forms that it takes. And I think if we're in ministry for some time, we have this sudden awareness that, wow, sin is deeper and more pervasive and uglier and more rooted than I thought it would be. Maybe at first in our early ministry, sin comes at us in more straightforward ways, and we kind of know what to expect, and we're able to counter it in God's truth. And then all of a sudden, something comes at us, and we didn't expect it to manifest itself in quite that way. Maybe we encounter sin more in the straightforward disobedience category, and then it comes at us in that sort of idolatry category, where it's person is loving what is wrong. They've got this idol that just has them in its grips, in its grasp, or maybe you encounter sin in terms of the just deceitfulness of it, right? That's part of what makes it so evil, is that you can't really. It's hard, I should say, not impossible, but hard to sort of get at what's really going on. It deceives, and the first person it deceives is the person who is actually sinning. We don't exactly know what we're doing sometimes. So sin has all these different manifestations. We encounter those in ministry, we encounter those in our own lives. Maybe we're a new Christian and the manifestations of sin seem somewhat straightforward, and then all of a sudden it comes at us in a little bit different perspective with a nuance that we haven't seen before. And we struggle at first to know how to counter it. In other words, this enemy that comes at us, this reality of sin, is multifaceted. It has many different masks that it wears, and many different ways in which it tries to take us down. That's we need to cling to God all the more. The other way in which I think we can find the multifaceted nature of sin useful is in understanding Paul's theology, which is really the point of this class. Notice that so many of the passages that I referenced were from the book of Romans. The book of Romans, as we'll look at shortly, is the book of Paul where he most clearly explores and extols the glory of the gospel, the glory of the work of Christ in us to make us new. And it's not surprising then that in this book where we see really the gospel and the newness displayed most clearly, we also see the nature of sin displayed most clearly. Paul seems to think that if we want to really grasp the heights to which Christ takes us, we must also grasp the depths, the lowness that sin takes us. So we see the contrast there. It's been said that till sin be bitter, Christ will not be sweet. Till sin be bitter, Christ will not be sweet. And I think Paul, in order to help us see the sweetness of Christ in Romans, also helps us see the bitterness of sin in Romans. Douglas Moo, theologian, and I've taken some of his outline here in the way I've presented this. He says, Paul's use of so many different words to refer to sin in its basic sense suggests how important the topic was for him and how many dimensions sin has. I think that's a good way to put it. We ought not to forget this as we come at the glory of Christ. We ought to remember that Christ overturns all of the many senses of sin, the many nuances and dimensions that it has. Well, let me stop there in this lecture. I'm going to break these up so that no one is too long, and I'll pick up where we left off.